7-year-old girl waited nervously in the schoolyard for the Father's Day party, where all the children would join special games with their dads. She was desperate, having promised her classmates that her dad would arrive at any moment. When she saw a well-dressed man about to get into a luxury car, she ran to him, clasped her hands and pleaded, "Uncle, can you be my dad at the school party? Every other dad can, except mine. Please." The man looked at her desperate face, then at the school full of happy families preparing for activities, and his heart tightened. He told her to wait just a minute and drove off, leaving the child in tears, convinced she had been let down once again. But what happened only minutes later changed not just that party, but both of their lives forever. The air in the schoolyard smelled of buttered popcorn and freshly cut grass, a mixture that, on any other day, would have made 7-year-old Lena's heart dance with joy. Today, however, every child's laugh sounded like thunder, and the colorful streamers swaying in the wind seemed to mock the tightness in her chest. The Father's Day field day was in full swing. Everywhere, proud fathers helped their children toss rings onto bottles, cheered them on in the sack race, or simply hugged them with a warmth that felt like a private sun, shining only on them. Lena stood outside that sun. The thin fabric of her slightly faded dress did nothing to protect her from the chill she felt inside. Her large brown eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a face she knew she wouldn't find. The lie, small at first, had snowballed, and now it threatened to bury her. "My dad is a very important man," she had told her classmates. "He travels a lot. That's why you never see him. But he promised he'd come today." Sophia, her classmate with perfect braids, walked over, holding the hand of a tall, smiling man. "Has he arrived yet, Lena?" "My dad brought cotton candy." Lena's stomach churned. She forced the bravest smile she could manage, the one she practiced in front of the cracked mirror at home. "Not yet. His work is complicated. It involves big deals and a lot of money. But he's on his way." Her teacher, Ms. Miller, cast a gentle, worried glance her way from over her glasses. She knew about Lena's situation, about the elderly grandmother, and the void the little girl tried to fill with fantastic stories. The teacher's heart broke a little, seeing her small student standing alone amid so much family celebration. With every passing minute, Lena's hope dwindled, replaced by a cold panic. The curious glances from other parents, the whispered questions from other children. Humiliation was a rising tide, about to drown her. That's when she saw him. Across the street, in front of the school gate, a black town car pulled up, so glossy it looked like a dark mirror. The door opened, and a man in an impeccably tailored grey suit stepped out. He wasn't young. He had silver hair at his temples and a serious, almost sad expression. He glanced at his wristwatch, a quick, precise gesture, before turning to get back in the car. To Lena, he wasn't a stranger. He was the embodiment of all the stories she'd invented. The important father, the businessman, the one who commanded a great fortune and had a private driver. In that instant, desperation transformed into a spark of insane courage. She didn't think. She didn't weigh the consequences. The only thing that mattered was silencing the giggles, erasing the looks of pity, and, for just one afternoon, belonging to that world of hugs and cotton candy. With her heart hammering against her ribs, Lena took a deep breath. Ignoring the voice of reason screaming in her mind, she darted through the school gate, her little feet in worn-out sandals slapping hastily on the sidewalk. The man already had his hand on the car door handle, about to disappear forever, taking her last, most fragile hope with him. "Excuse me, sir." Lena's voice came out as a whisper, faint and trembling. The man, already leaning into the car, froze mid-motion. He straightened up slowly, turning toward the source of the sound, his eyes, a grey that reminded her of a storm-tossed sky, landed on the tiny, breathless figure before him. The expression on his face was a mask of restrained impatience, that of someone whose time was a precious commodity, a capital that could not be squandered. Arthur Sterling was late for a crucial meeting where the future of a major investment would be decided. His mind was still on the numbers, the profit charts, the volatility of the stock market. The last thing he expected was to be interrupted by a child with tear-filled eyes and a wrinkled dress. He noticed the worn-out sandals, the slightly crooked ribbon in her brown hair, and, above all, the desperation stamped on every feature of her face. For a moment, the world of business, of fortunes and assets, dissolved. He saw only those enormous eyes which seemed to carry the weight of a sadness too old for such a tender age. Lena clasped her hands in front of her chest, a pleading gesture she'd seen in the soap operas her grandmother watched. The words she'd rehearsed in her head vanished, and what came out was a raw plea, born of the deepest panic. "Mister, can you be my dad for the school party?" she begged, her voice thick with emotion. "All the dads came, except mine. Please, it's just for a little while." Arthur blinked, genuinely taken aback. He was used to all kinds of requests: business proposals, donation solicitations, employee appeals. But this was different. The sincerity in the girl's plea completely disarmed him. He glanced over her shoulder at the schoolyard, vibrant with the family joy from which she was so painfully excluded. He saw the smiles, the hugs, the races, and then he looked back at her, an island of loneliness in an ocean of happiness, an old memory, a ghost of a pain he kept locked away in the vault of his soul. Scratched at the door, the memory of another child's laughter, of a small hand that used to hold his. He shook his head, pushing the image away. He began, his voice rougher than usual. "I can't. I have an appointment." The tears Lena had been holding back so fiercely finally escaped, rolling hot down her cheeks. The rejection, so expected and yet so brutal, hit her like a punch. "Please," she whispered, the last thread of hope unraveling. "I'll pretend you're my real dad. No one will know." Arthur felt something break inside him. This tiny creature was willing to accept a lie, a stranger, anything, just to not feel alone. He glanced at his watch again. The meeting, the millions at stake, it all suddenly seemed insignificant. He crouched down, bringing himself to her level, a gesture that surprised even himself. Looking into the girl's eyes, he saw an abyss of vulnerability. He made a decision his business logic would never approve. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Lena," she answered, sniffling. He managed a small smile. "Lena, wait right here for just a minute. Don't move." "Okay." Without waiting for a reply, he stood up, got into the luxury car, and closed the door with a soft click. Lena stood paralyzed on the sidewalk, her heart oscillating between terrifying hope and the certainty of disappointment. The car's engine purred to life, the vehicle pulled away from the curb, and in seconds it turned the corner, disappearing from view. The silence left behind was deafening. Lena stood there, alone, the tears now falling freely, watching the empty street where her last, most daring dream had just been run over. For Lena, every second that dragged on felt like an eternity. The sounds of the party, once just background noise, now assaulted her with their insistent joy. She saw Sophia run by, giggling as her father chased her with a stick of cotton candy. A lump formed in Lena's throat, so tight it hurt to breathe. "He's not coming back," a cruel little voice whispered in her mind. "No one ever comes back." She curled into a ball on the sidewalk, hugging her knees, trying to become invisible. The tears drying on her face left salty tracks on her skin. The humiliation she had tried to avoid now seemed inevitable, and 1,000 times worse. Not only did she not have a father, but she had been publicly rejected by a complete stranger. What would she tell her classmates now? The lie had crumbled, and she was buried beneath the rubble. Ms. Miller, the teacher, watched her from a distance, her heart aching with compassion. She walked toward the gate, her expression soft, ready to offer a comforting shoulder and bring her inside, away from the curious eyes. "Lena, sweetie," she began, her voice gentle, "let's go inside. We can get some ice cream from the cafeteria, just the two of us." But before Lena could answer, before she could surrender to defeat, the sound of a familiar engine approached. The same shiny black car turned the corner, gliding smoothly to a stop in the exact same spot as before. Lena's heart gave a leap so violent she thought it might escape through her mouth. The passenger door opened, and Arthur Sterling stepped out. But he was different. In one hand he held an enormous bouquet of colorful flowers, so large it nearly hid his face. In the other, a box of fine chocolates tied with a gold satin ribbon. His serious expression had been replaced by a hesitant, almost shy smile that softened the hard lines of his face. He walked over to Lena, who was still crouched on the ground, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I told you it would only be a minute," he said, his voice a little lighter now. "A father should never arrive at a party empty-handed, right?" He handed the bouquet to the teacher, who accepted it, stunned. "For you, Ms. Miller. And these," he said, holding out the box of chocolates to Lena, "are for you to share with your friends." Lena stood up slowly, her legs wobbly. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was like one of her stories, but this time it was happening for real. Arthur knelt again, adjusting the crooked ribbon in her hair with surprising gentleness. "Still need a dad for the party?" he asked in a low voice, so only she could hear. Lena could only nod, unable to form words. A sob of relief and joy escaped her lips. He smiled, a genuine smile this time that reached his grey eyes, warming them. He took her small hand in his large, calloused hand enveloping hers with a comforting heat. Together, they walked toward the school gate. As they entered the yard, a momentary silence fell over the children and parents nearby. All eyes turned to the girl who was always alone, now hand in hand with an elegant man who looked like he had stepped off the cover of a business magazine. Sophia and the other classmates stared, mouths agape. Arthur, sensing Lena's nervousness, squeezed her hand gently. He approached Ms. Miller, who was still holding the flowers, speechless. "Ma'am," he said with a calm, firm voice that commanded respect, "I apologize for the delay. I was held up with some business. I'm Arthur, Lena's father." The afternoon turned into a dream for Lena. Arthur, the man she had pulled from a life of figures and appointments, dove into his role with surprising dedication. He didn't just accompany her, he participated. With the sleeves of his expensive suit rolled up to his elbows, he knelt on the grass to help her with the egg and spoon race, cheering with genuine enthusiasm at every wobbly step she took. He bought 2 cones of cotton candy, one for each of them, and laughed when a bit of the pink sugar got stuck on his nose. For Lena, every moment was magical. The feeling of his hand holding hers was a safe harbor she had never known. The way he looked at her, with a focused attention that made her feel like the most important person in the world, was a balm for the invisible wounds of her loneliness. The other parents, initially curious, soon found themselves charmed by the scene. They watched the multimillionaire, whose photo occasionally appeared in the society pages, completely at ease, tossing rings and laughing with a little girl who clearly adored him. The envious whispers from the other children were replaced by looks of admiration. Lena's dad was the coolest one of all. As the party began to wind down, with the sun setting on the horizon and painting the sky orange and pink, a sense of melancholy began to settle in Lena's heart. The carriage was about to turn back into a pumpkin. The dream was coming to an end. Arthur led her to a quiet bench under the shade of an old oak tree. "Did you have fun?" he asked, his voice soft. Lena nodded, her eyes fixed on her sandals. "It was the best day of my life." She knew she had to tell the truth. The guilt of her lie weighed on her conscience, mixed with the fear that confessing would break the spell and he would disappear forever. I have to tell you something, she began, her voice little more than a whisper. I lied. Arthur remained silent, his patient gaze encouraging her to continue. You're not my dad, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I don't have a dad. I never have. The confession hung in the air between them. Lena squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the scolding, the disappointment, the goodbye. Instead, she felt his thumb trace a gentle circle on the back of her hand. I know, Lena, he said calmly. Lena looked up, surprised. You know? How? When a little girl has to ask a stranger to be her father, it's because there isn't a real one around, he explained, without a trace of judgment in his voice. But why did you do this for me? She asked, her curiosity overcoming her fear. Because you believed me? Arthur gazed into the distance. At the last few children leaving the schoolyard, his expression grew distant, veiled by a deep sadness. Because, a long time ago, I had a daughter. She would have been about your age now. The revelation took Lena by surprise. Where is she? He took a long moment to answer. She's gone, and today is her birthday. The weight of those words filled the silence. Lena understood. He wasn't just here for her, he was here for himself too, to fill a void that was just as big as her own. With the innocence and empathy that only children possess, Lena let go of his hand and, with a hesitant movement, wrapped her small arms around his neck, giving him a clumsy hug. I'm so sorry, she whispered near his ear. Arthur stiffened for a second, surprised by the gesture, and then slowly, he relaxed, wrapping his arms around her. In that embrace, two lonely souls, a man who had lost a daughter and a girl who had never had a father, found an unexpected solace. But when they pulled apart, reality returned. I have to go home now, Lena said. My grandma must be worried. Of course, I'll take you, Arthur offered, standing up. As they walked to the car, Lena's initial lie was replaced by a much more complex and fragile truth. She didn't just live without a father. I live with my grandma, she confessed shyly as he opened the car door for her. She's 85, and she's very sick. The luxury car glided silently through the familiar streets of Lena's neighborhood, a stark contrast to the buildings with peeling paint and cracked sidewalks. With every block they passed, the chasm between their two worlds became more evident. Lena guided Arthur through a maze of narrow streets until she pointed to a small house squeezed between two others, its paint faded and a small garden struggling to survive. This is it, she said in a low voice. If Arthur was shocked by the poverty of the place, he didn't show it. His expression remained neutral as he parked the car. He helped Lena out and walked her to the door. The inside of the house was tiny, but immaculately clean. Old, worn furniture was arranged with a care that revealed an effort to maintain dignity. In a sunken armchair sat a very frail old woman, her hair as white as snow and her skin as thin as paper. A shawl draped over her trembling shoulders. Her eyes, clouded with age, widened as she saw her granddaughter walk in hand with such an imposing man. Grandma, this is Mr. Sterling. Lena introduced him, her voice filled with a newfound pride. He came to my party at school. Elvira, the grandmother, tried to stand, but her legs faltered. Arthur stepped forward. Please, don't get up, ma'am. He extended his hand, and hers, gnarled and trembling, gripped his with surprising strength. It's a pleasure to meet you. In the days that followed, Arthur became a constant, though discreet, presence in the lives of Lena and her grandmother. He didn't arrive with fanfare, but his influence was felt in every corner. One day, a large basket of fruit and groceries appeared on their doorstep. The next, a technician came to fix the old heater that barely worked. Arthur called every day to check on them and would stop by in the late afternoon to help Lena with her homework, explaining fractions with the same patience he would use to explain stock fluctuations to an investor. For Lena, It was like living the fairy tale she had always dreamed of. For Elvira, however, the presence of this wealthy, powerful man was a source of both joy and a growing anxiety. She saw the light in her granddaughter's eyes, the way she blossomed under Arthur's attention, and her grandmother's heart filled with gratitude. But she also saw the looks from the neighbors. The visit from the luxury car had not gone unnoticed. At the small corner grocery store, the whispers began. Mrs. Gable, whose window looked directly onto Lena's house, was the most vocal. "What does a man like that, a billionaire, want with people like us?" she would ask loudly to anyone who would listen. "It can't be anything good. He must have ulterior motives. Men with that much money don't do anything for free." The rumors, like weeds, spread quickly. The malicious stories painted Arthur as a villain, a man taking advantage of a child's naivety and an old woman's fragility for unknown, sinister purposes. Envy fueled the suspicion. Why them and not us? What was the secret? Elvira felt the weight of those accusing stares whenever she went out to buy bread. Arthur's kindness, which should have been a blessing, was turning into a social curse, isolating them even more. The situation reached a crisis point when someone, driven by malice or a twisted sense of concern, made an anonymous call. On a grey Tuesday afternoon, a stern-faced woman with a clipboard knocked on the door. "I'm Miss Davies, from Child Protective Services," she announced, her voice cold and bureaucratic. "We received a report concerning the welfare of the minor residing at this address. I need to ask a few questions." Lena's world, which had finally started to gain color, suddenly turned to gray. Fear, an old acquaintance, tightened its grip on her heart. The impassive woman entered, her eyes assessing every detail of the humble home. And Lena knew that the man who had come to be her father for a day had brought with him a storm that threatened to sweep her away from everything she had ever known. Ms. Davies conducted the interview with a chilling efficiency. Her questions were like tiny needles, probing the most vulnerable points of Lena and Elvira's life. She asked about their diet, school routine, living conditions, and, with particular emphasis, about the recent presence of Arthur Sterling. "And who is this gentleman?" she asked, her pen hovering over the form. "What is the nature of his relationship with the child?" Elvira, her voice trembling, tried to explain the man's kindness, the episode at the party, the help he had been offering, but her words, filtered through the social worker's suspicion, sounded fragile, almost like a confession of inadequacy. Lena, sitting on a small stool in the corner, felt like a butterfly pinned to a board, being examined by eyes that didn't see her beauty, only her fragility. The visit left a trail of apprehension in the small house. The threat, once whispered on street corners, now had an official face and a clipboard. In the following days, the shadow of CPS loomed over them. Lena went to school with her stomach in knots, terrified that she would return to find the house empty and her grandmother taken away somewhere. Arthur, upon being informed of the situation, was furious. It was the fury of a man accustomed to moving mountains with a phone call. He mobilized his lawyers, men in suits who spoke in terms of jurisdiction and protocols. But the bureaucracy of the system was a different kind of enemy than a corporate board. It was slow, impersonal, and relentless. "We have to be careful, Arthur," his lead attorney advised. "Any false move could be interpreted as an attempt to use your power and wealth to influence the process. That would be disastrous." CPS restricted Arthur's visits, claiming his presence could interfere with the impartial assessment of the family environment. For Lena, it was as if the sun had been switched off. The days turned grey again, filled with her grandmother's anxiety and the heavy silence that settled after dinner. Her only connection to Arthur was the nightly phone calls, quick, whispered conversations under Elvira's watchful eye. The constant pressure began to undermine the grandmother's already fragile health. She slept poorly, ate little, and her walk, once just slow, became shaky and uncertain. One night, the worst happened. Lena woke to a dull thud from the hallway. She ran out of her room to find her grandmother on the floor, groaning in pain, her face pale in the faint moonlight streaming through the window. Panic seized Lena. She didn't know what to do. The phone felt like an alien object in her trembling hands. She could only think of one name, one person who could help her. With icy fingers, she dialed the number she already knew by heart. "Arthur," she cried when he answered, her voice choked with sobs. "It's Grandma. She fell. She won't get up." On the other end of the line, Arthur heard the terror in the little girl's voice and didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way. Call an ambulance. Lena, dial the number I taught you. I'll meet you at the hospital." Within minutes, the wail of a siren cut through the night's silence, filling the small street with flashing red and blue lights. The neighbors, including Mrs. Gable, peered from their windows, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and a pang of guilt. As the paramedics carefully placed Elvira on a stretcher, Lena stood in the doorway, small and lost in the chaos. She was alone, completely alone for the first time in her life. The fear she felt was no longer just about losing her grandmother. It was the fear of being swallowed by the darkness, of having no one in the world to hold her hand. And in the midst of this overwhelming terror, one question echoed in her mind. Would Arthur come? Or would the CPS ban keep him away, leaving her to face the longest night of her life with no one by her side? The hospital smelled of antiseptic and a palpable anxiety that seemed to soak into the walls. Lena sat on an orange plastic chair, too big for her in the cold, impersonal emergency room hallway. Her legs barely reached the floor, swinging in a nervous rhythm. Every time a door swung open, her heart leapt, hoping to see the familiar face of her grandmother or of Arthur. But it was always strangers, their faces etched with worry or pain. A kind nurse had offered her a cup of milk and a cookie, but the food sat untouched. The lump in her throat was too big to swallow. She felt like a paper boat in an ocean, tiny and adrift. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, a monotonous sound that amplified her sense of isolation. And then she saw him, striding down the hall. Arthur. He wasn't in his impeccable suit, but in casual pants and a simple shirt, wrinkled as if he had thrown it on in a hurry. His hair was messy and there were dark circles under his eyes, but to Lena, he had never looked more majestic. He spotted her, and his worried expression softened for an instant. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the cold hospital floor. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice low and laden with genuine concern. Lena didn't answer with words. She just threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his shoulder, and the sobs she had been holding back finally came, racking her small body. Arthur hugged her tightly, stroking her hair, whispering words of comfort that were a balm to her panic. "It's going to be okay. I'm here. You're not alone." He stayed with her, holding her hand as the hours dragged on. He spoke with the doctors, his calm authority getting answers a 7-year-old girl never could. The diagnosis came at dawn. Elvira had fractured her hip. She would need surgery and a long period of recovery. "She'll be all right," the doctor told Arthur, "but she won't be in any condition to care for a child for a long time." Those words, though spoken to Arthur, rang in Lena's ears like a sentence. CPS, a foster home. The reality of her situation came crashing down on her with full force. With her grandmother incapacitated, she no longer had a home. Arthur, noticing the color drain from the girl's face, took her to the hospital cafeteria. While she stirred a hot chocolate, he made a series of phone calls. His voice was firm, issuing orders, mobilizing his army of lawyers and assistants. He was fighting a war on a front she couldn't see, a battle of bureaucracy and law. At noon, Miss Davies from CPS arrived at the hospital. Her expression was even more severe than before. "Mr. Sterling," she said, without preamble. "Given the circumstances, the minor can no longer remain in the grandmother's care. We will begin proceedings to transfer her to a temporary shelter. That's out of the question, Arthur replied, standing up, his height and presence dominating the small space. I will take responsibility for her. Miss Davies raised an eyebrow. You have no legal relationship with the child. There's no basis for such a request. The law is clear. Arthur's lawyer, who had arrived minutes earlier, stepped in. We are filing for an emergency temporary custody based on the established emotional bond. The social worker let out a short, humorless laugh. Emotional bond? A millionaire who's known a poor girl for a few weeks. A judge will laugh at that. The investigation into your true intentions is still ongoing, Mr. Sterling. And frankly, it doesn't look good. She turned to Lena, who was watching the exchange with her heart in her throat. Come on, sweetie, let's get your things. The moment Lena had dreaded most had arrived. Arthur moved to stand protectively between her and the woman. You're not taking her anywhere. But Ms. Davies had the law on her side. She took out her phone. If you insist, I'll be forced to call the police to have you removed for obstruction. The standoff was terrible. Lena saw the frustration and helplessness on the face of the man who had become her hero. He had all the money, all the power, but he was being defeated by a form and a regulation. There seemed to be no way out. It was then that one of the doctors treating Elvira approached the group, holding a chart with a confused expression. Excuse me, he said, addressing Arthur and the social worker. We were reviewing the patient's old records, Mrs. Elvira's, and there's something you need to know. According to the original birth certificate filed when she was first admitted to this hospital years ago, Elvira is not Lena's biological grandmother. The doctor's revelation dropped into the hospital corridor like a silent bomb, leaving a wake of shock and confusion. Lena, Miss Davies, even Arthur, all of them stood frozen, processing the information. Elvira, the only mother figure Lena had ever known. The woman whose trembling hands had raised her was not her grandmother by blood. The floor seemed to vanish from under Lena's feet. If Grandma wasn't her grandma, then who was she? And who was Lena? Ms. Davies was the first to recover, her bureaucratic eyes gleaming with a new and terrible clarity. This changes everything, she said, her voice heavy with official weight. The child has no known relatives. She is, for all legal purposes, an orphan. State custody is immediate and unquestionable. The words orphan and state custody echoed in Lena's mind. They sounded cold, final, and terrifying. The threat of being taken to a shelter, once a hazy fear, had now become a steel-trap certainty. Arthur felt Lena's hand tremble in his. He looked down at the girl's pale face, at her terror-widened eyes, and a protective, primal, all-consuming fury took hold of him. And you will not lay a finger on her, he snarled at the social worker, his voice low and dangerous. We are not done yet. The legal battle that followed was brutal. Arthur mobilized his entire fortune, turning his wealth into an army of lawyers. They worked day and night, scouring laws and precedents, trying to find a loophole, anything that could keep Lena out of the system. But the system was a leviathan. The lack of a blood tie was an almost insurmountable barrier. Meanwhile, the story leaked to the press. A disgruntled former employee of Arthur's, fired for dishonesty and hungry for revenge, saw his chance. He went to a tabloid paper, feeding them distorted information and half-truths. He's always been obsessed with losing his daughter, the ex-employee said in an anonymous interview. Now he's trying to buy a replacement. It's sick. The headlines were cruel. Billionaire tries to adopt poor orphan, charity or whim. The magnate's dark side, the girl and the empire. Public opinion, swayed by the venomous articles, began to turn against him. The same people who once admired his business acumen and high-yield stock investments now viewed him with suspicion. He was no longer a philanthropist, but an eccentric predator. The malicious rumors from Lena's neighbors, once confined to their small street, were now splashed across newspapers and discussed on television shows. The narrative the media created was toxic. A rich, powerful man using his money to manipulate a tragic situation, exploiting a child's vulnerability to satisfy his own emotional needs. CPS, pressured by the media attention, became even more inflexible. They saw Arthur not as a savior, but as the center of a scandal. Keeping Lena away from him became a matter of principle, a way to prove the system didn't bow to power and wealth. For Lena, who was placed in a temporary foster home while the case was decided, the world became a nightmare. She was surrounded by strange faces in a place that didn't have the familiar smell of her home or the warmth of her grandmother's embrace. Arthur's visits were short, supervised, and painful. They would sit in a sterile room with a social worker watching every word, every gesture. It was impossible to really talk. The bond they had built at the school party, on the bench under the oak tree, seemed to be fraying under the relentless pressure of the outside world. During one of these visits, Lena noticed how tired Arthur looked. He was thinner, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the battle. "Are you okay?" she asked, her concern plain in her childish voice. Arthur forced a smile. "I'm fighting, kiddo. For us." But as he spoke, Lena saw something in his eyes that scared her more than any newspaper headline. A shadow of doubt, a flicker of exhaustion that suggested maybe, just maybe, this was a fight that not even all his money could win. The custody hearing was set for a Friday, exactly 3 weeks after the Father's Day field day. The courtroom was an intimidating place, with its dark wood paneling and high ceiling that seemed to swallow all sound. Lena sat next to one of Arthur's lawyers, feeling small and insignificant amid the solemnity of the room. Arthur was on the other side, flanked by his legal team. His eyes met hers for a moment, and he gave her an almost imperceptible nod, a silent promise that he would fight to the end. The prosecution, representing the state, was relentless. They painted a picture of Arthur as an unstable man, haunted by grief, whose sudden fixation on Lena was at best inappropriate and at worst dangerous. They presented the newspaper clippings, the interviews with the ex-employee, the anonymous reports from the neighbors. Every word was a stone thrown at Arthur's character. This man, the prosecutor argued, his voice echoing through the court, is attempting to use his vast net worth, his billion-dollar assets, to circumvent the law. He believes his dollars can buy anything, even a child. But justice, Your Honor, is not for sale. Arthur's team fought back, presenting witnesses, friends and colleagues, who described him as a man of integrity and generosity. Ms. Miller, Lena's teacher, also testified, speaking emotionally about the transformation she had seen in the girl since Arthur came into her life. "I have never seen Lena so happy, so confident," she said, her eyes welling up. He didn't just give her material things, he gave her hope. But the turning point of the hearing came when the judge addressed Arthur directly. "Mr. Sterling," the magistrate, a white-haired man with a stern expression, said, "The court acknowledges your philanthropic contributions and your apparent affection for the child. However, the law is clear regarding the lack of kinship. The prosecution suggests your actions are motivated by unresolved personal trauma. What do you have to say to that?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Arthur stood, his hands resting on the table before him. He looked at the judge, but it was as if he were speaking to the entire world. His voice, when it came, was quiet but laden with an ancient-seeming pain. "Your Honor," he began, "it's true. 5 years ago, I lost my only daughter, Anna. She was 6. An accident, a tragedy that destroyed my life." He paused, swallowing hard. Lena felt a pang in her heart. He had never told her the details. "For years, I buried myself in work. I amassed a fortune, built an empire. I thought that success, profits, dividends could fill the emptiness. But they didn't. Gold and crypto can't hug you at night. Stocks on the exchange can't laugh at your jokes. His eyes turned to Lena. That day, in front of the school, when Lena asked me to be her father, I didn't see a replacement for my daughter. I saw a child who was just as lonely as I was, and in her desperation, I saw a chance. Not to get my daughter back, that's impossible, but a chance for redemption. A chance to turn my greatest pain into a purpose, to use everything I've built, not for myself, but to give one little girl the life my own daughter never had. The confession was devastating in its honesty. He didn't try to hide his pain or his motives. He laid them bare, raw and vulnerable. For the court to judge, Lena felt tears stream down her face. He didn't see her as a replacement, but as herself. The judge watched him for a long time, his expression unreadable. The prosecution shifted, uncomfortable. Arthur's sincerity had changed the atmosphere in the room, but the law was still the law. Your words are moving, Mr. Sterling, the judge said finally, but emotion does not constitute a legal basis. The child will be placed in a residential facility in another city where she can have a fresh start away from this media circus. This case is closed. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was like a gunshot to Lena's heart. It was over. They had lost. She would be taken far away to a strange place, and she would never see Arthur or her grandmother again. Across the room, Arthur seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The defeat hit him visibly, draining him of all his strength. He had gambled everything and lost. The judge's decision hung in the air, cold and final. For Lena, it was as if the world had been turned upside down and everything good had fallen out of her pockets. The facility in another city sounded like an exile, a place with no familiar faces, no warm hand of Arthur's to hold, no whispered stories from her grandmother. Ms. Davies approached her with an expression that tried to be kind but only managed to look pitying. "Come on, Lena, it's time." Arthur, across the room, made a move as if to cross the space between them, but his lawyers held him back, whispering urgent words in his ear. The helplessness on his face was the most painful thing Lena had ever seen. He, the man who commanded international corporations, who made fortunes with a single phone call, could do nothing to stop a frightened little girl from being torn out of his life. The procedure would be swift. She would be picked up from school the following Monday. The weekend was a slow torture. Lena was allowed one final, supervised visit with her grandmother at the rehabilitation hospital. Elvira, still bedridden and frail, wept silently as she held her granddaughter's hand. "Be a good girl, my love," she whispered, her voice weak. "Be strong." Lena tried to be strong, but inside she was falling apart. That night in her room at the foster home, she hugged the small teddy bear Arthur had given her, the only tangible remnant of her brief fairy tale. She wondered if he was thinking of her. Arthur, for his part, was in his study, a vast space overlooking the glittering city, which that night seemed cold and empty. He ignored calls from his partners, reports on his companies, cash flow, the fluctuations of the crypto market. None of it mattered. He replayed the hearing in his mind, over and over, searching for a mistake, an unsaid word, a different strategy that might have changed the outcome. The confession of his pain, which he thought had been his most powerful weapon, had been dismissed as mere emotion. He felt like a fool, a billionaire fool who thought he could fight the system and win. His lead attorney called. "Arthur, and there's still a chance. We can appeal. It'll be a long, expensive battle, and the odds are slim, but..." "Do it," Arthur interrupted, his voice devoid of any energy. "Do whatever it takes." But he knew the legal process was slow. An appeal would take months, maybe years, and in the meantime, Lena would be far away, in a group home, her childhood slipping away in institutional hallways. The thought was unbearable. Monday morning arrived, grey and damp, mirroring Lena's mood. At school, The atmosphere was somber. Ms. Miller hugged her tightly, her eyes red. The other children, who had once envied her, now looked at her with a confused compassion. They didn't fully understand what was happening, only that Lena was leaving. At 10 o'clock, the CPS car pulled up in front of the school. Miss Davies and a male colleague got out, their expressions professional and impassive. They entered the principal's office, where Lena was waiting, clutching a small backpack with her few belongings. Lena's heart was pounding. This was it, the end of the line. She glanced out the window one last time at the schoolyard where it had all begun, where she had run up to a stranger and made the most impossible request. And then she saw him. Standing across the street in the fine drizzle was Arthur. He wasn't looking at the school, but down at his phone, typing furiously. For a moment, hope bloomed in Lena's chest. He had come to save her, but he just stood there, looking as lost and powerless as she felt. Miss Davies placed a hand on Lena's shoulder. "It's time, sweetie." Silent tears rolled down Lena's face as she let herself be led out of the office, toward the school's front door, toward the car that would take her to her new, lonely life. As they reached the main entrance, Miss Davies' cell phone rang. She answered it with impatience. Davies." She listened for a moment, her expression shifting from irritation to utter disbelief. "What? That's impossible. How did he—" She looked through the glass doors at Arthur, who had now pocketed his phone and was looking directly at them, an expression of fierce determination on his face. The social worker lowered the phone, stunned. There's been a change of plans," she stammered. "An injunction from a higher court. The removal has been stayed." The word "stayed" hung in the air, charged with an almost magical power. For Lena, it was as if someone had stopped time a second before disaster. The hand on her shoulder pulled back as if it had touched a hot stove. Confusion was plain on the faces of Mrs. Davies and her colleague. Higher court injunctions didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were the result of complex legal maneuvering and usually considerable influence. Arthur crossed the street, the fine mist settling in his silver hair. He didn't run, but walked with a purpose that made the world seem to part for him. At his side, his lawyer appeared, holding a leather briefcase that looked like it contained all the secrets of the universe. "Ms. Davies," the lawyer said with an icy calm, handing her a sheet of paper. "This is an emergency court order, signed by the chief appellate judge. It grants my client, Mr. Arthur Sterling, immediate temporary custody of Lena, pending the appeal. Any attempt to remove the child will constitute contempt of court." The social worker snatched the document, her eyes scanning the lines with a mixture of rage and astonishment. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Arthur had somehow gone to the very top of the judicial chain in a matter of hours. What no one on the school sidewalk knew was the cost of that victory. The night before, in an act of desperation and strategic genius, Arthur had made the most radical move of his career. He didn't use his money to bribe, but to sacrifice. He contacted the board of his flagship company, the source of most of his immense wealth, and announced his immediate and unconditional resignation as CEO. Furthermore, he pledged to place the majority of his stock holdings, a multi-billion-dollar fortune, into an irrevocable trust fund whose sole purpose would be to finance social projects for underprivileged children across the country. The first project, he announced in a press release sent out in the pre-dawn hours, would be the creation of a family support center at Lena's own school. The news had detonated in the financial world. The stock market reeled. Analysts couldn't understand why a man at the height of his power would abdicate everything. But the move wasn't for the financial markets. It was for a single judge. By publicly relinquishing control of his empire and converting his fortune into a social good, Arthur had removed the prosecution's main weapon, the argument that he was a billionaire using his power for personal gain. He was no longer trying to buy a child. He was sacrificing his capital to help many. Starting with one, The news of the trust and his resignation reached the chief appellate judge's desk, along with the petition for an injunction. The judge, seeing the situation in a new light, no longer a capricious tycoon, but a philanthropist on a personal mission, granted the order. In front of the school, the reality of that monumental victory boiled down to one simple, profound moment. Arthur knelt in front of Lena, ignoring the lawyer's briefcase and the social worker's shocked stare. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're coming home with me." Lena, who had been watching it all as if in a dream, finally understood. The tears of sorrow turned into tears of relief, so overwhelming it left her breathless. She threw herself into his arms, the familiar scent of his wool coat the safest place in the world. Ms. Davies, defeated, just shook her head and turned away, walking back to the official car with her colleague. They had lost, and they didn't even understand how the battle had been won. As Arthur led Lena to his car, the lawyer walked with him. "That was the riskiest play I've ever seen, Arthur. You gave up almost everything. Your partners are furious. You've lost a generational fortune." Arthur opened the door for Lena and helped her inside, carefully buckling her seatbelt. He looked at the lawyer over the roof of the car, a tired but genuine smile on his face. "I didn't lose a thing," he said. "For the first time in years, I feel like I've gained something that actually matters." Arthur's house wasn't a house. It was an estate, tucked behind high walls and a wrought iron gate. The mansion stood amidst meticulously landscaped grounds, looking more like a museum than a home. For Lena, used to the two cramped rooms she shared with her grandmother, the place was breathtakingly vast. The entryway had a ceiling so high her voice echoed, and the marble floor was so polished she could see her own reflection. A kind-faced housekeeper named Lucia greeted her with a warm smile and led her to a bedroom that looked like it had come from a fairy tale. It had a four-poster bed, a shelf full of new books, and a window that overlooked a garden with a treehouse. Despite all the luxury, the silence of the house was heavy. Every room, decorated with fine art and elegant furniture, seemed haunted by an absence. It was the house of a lonely man, a castle built to protect a wounded heart. Arthur, sensing Lena's unease, did his best to fill the emptiness. He taught her to play chess in the enormous library. They made cookies in the stainless steel kitchen, messing up the immaculate space with flour. And he read to her every night before she went to sleep. Slowly, the house began to change. The echoes were replaced with laughter, the silent hallways filled with the sound of running feet. Lucia, the housekeeper, confided in Arthur one day, "The house is alive again, sir." The legal battle, however, was not over. The custody was temporary. The prosecution, humiliated by Arthur's maneuver, prepared for the appeal hearing, determined to prove that his financial sacrifice was just a facade, a public relations stunt. They intensified their investigations, digging into every aspect of Arthur's life, looking for any rot under the gilded surface. The weeks that followed were a bittersweet mix of domestic happiness and the tension of the impending war. Arthur spent his days in meetings with lawyers and his afternoons building a swing set with Lena in the garden. He was discovering a new kind of wealth, one not measured in interest or returns, but in smiles and hugs. The moment of truth arrived on the day of the final hearing. This time, the courtroom was packed with reporters. The story of the billionaire who gave up his fortune for an orphan had captured the public's imagination. The prosecution made their case, arguing that Arthur's resignation was a manipulation. "He has not ceased to be a powerful man," the prosecutor argued. "He's merely changed the nature of his power. He's using this child to rebrand himself as a saint, a philanthropist. It is the most sophisticated form of selfishness." Arthur's defense then called its final witness. To everyone's surprise, it wasn't an expert or an influential friend. It was Lena, small and wearing a simple dress Arthur had bought for her. She walked to the witness stand, her legs barely reaching the floor. The judge, The same one from the first hearing looked at her kindly. "Do you know why you're here, Lena?" "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice clear and firm, surprising everyone, "to talk about Arthur." Arthur's lawyer began the questioning. "Lena, what has Mr. Sterling given you since you've known him?" The prosecution sat up, expecting a list of expensive gifts they could use against him. Lena thought for a moment. "He gave me a coat for when it's cold," she began, "and he taught me how to tie my shoes. He helps me with my math homework, even when I don't get it. He reads me stories, and he does funny voices for the characters. And," she paused, looking directly at Arthur, "when I have nightmares, he sits by my bed until I fall asleep again. He gave me a father." The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Objection! The witness is a child. She's being influenced." But the judge waved him into silence. He leaned forward, looking directly at Lena. "Lena," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "a father is a very important thing. Do you think Mr. Sterling is a good father?" Lena didn't hesitate. She turned to the judge, her large eyes serious. "Before I met Arthur, I had to make up stories so I wouldn't feel alone. Now, I don't have to make them up anymore. He taught me that family isn't about where you come from or having the same blood. It's about who stands by you when you need them most." She then looked over at Arthur, who was watching her with tears in his eyes. "He didn't just stand by me, Your Honor. He gave up everything to stand by me. He didn't try to buy me. He showed me what real love means." A deep, reverent silence filled the courtroom. In that moment, there were no more prosecutors or defense attorneys, just the simple, unshakable truth spoken from the mouth of a child. Lena's words hung in the courtroom, disarming all the legal complexity with their crushing simplicity. The judge, a man who had spent his life analyzing facts and statutes, found himself faced with an emotional truth that no legal argument could refute. He looked at the prosecutor, whose face was a mask of defeat, then at Arthur, whose own face was wet with silent tears, and finally at the small girl on the witness stand, who radiated a wisdom far beyond her years. He cleared his throat, the sound abnormally loud in the quiet. "The child's testimony stands," he declared, his voice firm but laced with emotion. "This court has heard enough." He did not retire to deliberate. The decision was already formed, crystal clear in his mind. Considering the extraordinary sacrifice of Mr. Sterling, which demonstrates a commitment that transcends any material interest, and most importantly, considering the profound and evident emotional bond demonstrated here today, the judge said, looking directly at Lena and Arthur, "This court grants Mr. Arthur Sterling the full and permanent adoption of the minor, Lena. This case is closed." The sound of the gavel this time wasn't a gunshot, but a symphony. Overwhelming relief flooded the room. Arthur shot to his feet and, ignoring all protocol, rushed to Lena, scooping her off the witness stand and swinging her around in a hug that was a mix of laughter and sobs. The reporters, for a moment, forgot their cameras and notepads, witnessing a moment of pure human joy. The exit from the courthouse was a blur of flashes and questions, but Arthur and Lena were in their own bubble, hand in hand, shielded from the storm by their new status, family. Their first stop was the rehabilitation center. Elvira, sitting in a wheelchair by the window, saw them arrive. When Arthur told her the news, tears of joy streamed down her wrinkled face. "I knew it," she whispered, taking Arthur's hand. "I saw the goodness in your eyes from the very first day. I couldn't have asked for a better guardian angel for my girl." Arthur then made her a promise. "You aren't just like her grandmother. You are her grandmother, period. As soon as you're discharged, there's a room waiting for you at our house. A family takes care of its own." The resolution of their conflicts extended beyond the walls of their new home. The trust fund Arthur had created was already bearing its first fruits. The first initiative, as promised, was at Lena's school. A formerly disused classroom was completely renovated and transformed. The walls were painted in bright colors with cheerful murals. Shelves were filled with books and games. Tables were set with art supplies and computers. In the following weeks, life settled into a new and wonderful normal. Elvira moved into the mansion, where she was cared for by nurses and surrounded by Lena's laughter. The house, once a mausoleum of sorrow, became a true home, filled with warmth and life. Lena's old neighbors, including Mrs. Gable, seeing the news and the creation of the support center in their neighborhood school, felt a pang of shame. The malice they had spread was dissipated by an act of generosity so large it was impossible to ignore. One day, Mrs. Gable approached Lena at the school gate, handing her a small cake she'd baked. I was wrong, kid," she said, unable to meet Lena's eyes. "Your father, he's a good man." Lena, with her endless capacity for forgiveness, simply smiled. "I know." Arthur learned that a true inheritance wasn't in the assets he accumulated, but in the love he shared. He discovered that fatherhood wasn't about blood ties, but about the daily decision to show up, to care, to sacrifice. He hadn't replaced the daughter he'd lost, but he had honored her memory by giving another child the chance at a life full of love and security. He healed his own pain by healing someone else's. 5 weeks later, the schoolyard was once again bathed in sunlight and filled with laughter. But for Lena, the world was an entirely different place. The scent of popcorn and funnel cake was no longer a painful reminder of what she lacked, but the fragrance of a happy day, a day of belonging. It was another Father's Day field day. This time, Lena wasn't standing alone by the gate. She was in the center of the yard, holding Arthur's hand, wearing a light blue dress that twirled when she spun. Her shoes were new, but her smile was the same, maybe a little less forced, more genuine. Arthur wasn't wearing a business suit. He wore a light linen shirt, looking lighter himself, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. They weren't just attendees. This year's celebration was centered around the large tent that bore the words, "The Family Support Center." It was the first project of Arthur's fund, a safe place where children in vulnerable situations could get support, snacks, and homework help, where no parent working late had to worry, and no child had to feel alone. Lena watched it all with her observant eyes. She saw a girl win the sack race with the help of a volunteer from the center. She saw a boy whose father was deployed, proudly building a block castle with a monitor. Then, her gaze fell on a small boy sitting on a bench, a little apart from the others, staring at his own shoes, just as she had done 5 weeks ago. Her heart recognized that loneliness. She squeezed Arthur's hand and tugged on his sleeve. "Dad," she whispered, the words still sounding like music to her ears. He leaned down, his face now a map of tenderness. "Yes, my daughter." She pointed discreetly with her chin. "That little boy looks sad. Do you think we can help him too?" Arthur looked at the boy and then back at Lena. A huge smile, filled with a pride that no multi-million-dollar deal had ever given him, lit up his face. He knelt in front of her. "I think so. I think that's exactly why we're here." Later, as they walked through the yard, they passed the door to the room where the previous party had been, the place where her desperation had turned to courage. Now, a shining brass plaque was affixed to the wall. Lena stood on her tiptoes to read the engraved words, "The Family Support Center, where no child stands alone." She ran her fingers over the letters, a permanent reminder of her journey. The girl who had lied about having a father had discovered she didn't need to lie about having a family. She could build one, forged not in blood, but in love and courage. And the millionaire who had lost a daughter and tried to fill the void with an incalculable fortune had learned that true fatherhood wasn't in genetic inheritance, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything, his empire, his capital, his past, for the ones you love. The school party that had begun as a desperate lie had become the foundation of a real family and the beginning of a legacy of kindness. It proved that sometimes the greatest truths are born from the most vulnerable moments of our lives, and that love, sparked by the most unlikely request, can indeed change the world, one child at a time.